Welcome to Cardiff School of Planning and Geography's first Innovation and Engagement public lecture of our 2014-15 academic year. We're really pleased that there's been such a good turnout for this session tonight on what we are coming back to in a couple of events is a theme related to high streets retailing and how our town centres are faring. And before I introduce tonight's session, what I would like to do is just flag up for you another event in about a month's time on a related theme. We have Bill Grimsey, a retailer who took on himself to prepare an alternative strategy for the high street than the one being delivered by Mary Portas, which he didn't quite agree with, and is involved in an advisory group that's informing the Labour Party on the future of town centres. So that takes place, evening event, on Tuesday the 11th of November. So if you are interested in tonight's theme, we'd be very happy for you to be invited back to that one. Please again do register through the Innovation and Engagement lecture series. So that's titled Preparing Town Centres and High Streets for the 21st Century. I'll put that aside and move on to tonight's lecture. As I say, it's the first in our Innovation and Engagement public lecture series, titled Adaptively Resilient High Streets, What We Learned from the Economic Crisis. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Neil Wrigley back to the school. Neil was formerly head of school when it was head of town planning initially, and then titled School of City and Regional Planning. So this is a coming back for Neil in many ways, and his CV also indicates that he started with a good solid BA in geography from the University of Wales as well. So it is a coming back for Neil in many ways. Looking at Neil's CV, very prestigious CV, fellow of the British Academy, academician of the Academy of Social Sciences, which I always find incredibly hard to say. I wish they'd chosen a better acronym. And involved in a wide range of editorial work for journals. And the CV, which is on the web if you would like to see it, littered with extensive material on geographies of consumption and retailing and town centres, and a wide range of academic work and applied policy work as well. So it's kind of a really nice CV that bridges the worlds of academia and practice. Tonight we invited Neil to deliver a presentation based on some research he's done, some ESRC research, but also for government as well. So we're tapping into Neil's expertise and his colleague Dionysius as well, who's kind of here as part of his research team tonight. Format of tonight, if I can remind you to turn off your mobile phones. There are no fire alarms planned, so if it happens, it's a real thing, and we meet outside in the rain on the steps of the Morgan building. Okay. On that basis, we're going to allow Neil to speak for around 35-40 minutes, and then allow 20-25 minutes for questions this evening. So we should be all done by 7 o'clock this evening. So that's our schedule for tonight. On that basis, I request that you give a warm welcome to Neil, and we'll take his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It really is delightful to be back in Cardiff, and very pleased to see recent members of staff at Southampton who migrated here. We can have a staff meeting afterwards. So it's really a good opportunity to talk to you. I'm very flattered to be invited. The theme we're looking at tonight, as Neil has said, is one which has attracted a lot of public attention recently. And I want to try and attack it in this particular way. First of all, I want to talk about the way the shockwave of global financial crisis impacted Britain's town centres and high streets. I want to say something about government's response to that and the various stakeholder responses to it. The High Street Forum, which was set up under the Conservative government, and then the ESRC DCLG evidence review and some of what it showed. And then because this is an academic presentation, and because Kevin's here, I'll say something about adaptively resilient high streets, thinking about the concept to try and show you that this is not just all practical. Okay, so what I'm not going to do, however, what I'm not going to do this evening is to talk about or attempt to forecast the future of high streets. I always find such attempts rather embarrassing because they soon go off beam after a few years. I've got a lecture that's on digital piracy, the digital storm, which is brilliant. It involves a brilliant film on digital piracy, except when it comes to the future, and then it says, and there's this thing called the broadband, and the students all fall apart laughing. It rather destroys it. So I'm not going to do anything like this. I'll leave this to my successors to make fools of themselves. I'll move on to actual research. Right. The global economic crisis really did have a big impact. In the late 2007 and early 2008, consumer confidence in the UK really fell off the wall, really, as you can see. And it took till beginning of this year to get back to where we've been in 2007. A long period of austerity by anyone's calculation. And of course, what we saw in consumer confidence was mirrored in GDP, and we went almost into a triple dip recession. Family incomes stagnated during this period, and we all suffered the consequences of that. Retail vacancy rates during this period shot up. Basically, they went through waves of bankruptcies, in fact, our administrations, and they've reached a peak in October 2012. Since October 2012, the vacancy rates have consistently fallen, so we're really on a steep downward track in vacancy rates. So we're coming out of this long period of austerity and recession, and the hierarchy and the high street is showing up. Of course, Britain is a very geographically divided country, and what occurs in London doesn't occur in Leeds, and you've always got to remember the big differences between north and south. Now, the thing about the shockwave of global financial crisis is what it did was effectively strip away the froth on the system, and it unmasked the medium and longer term forces which have been changing retail for some considerable time, changing the high street for some considerable time. And we call those changes the slow burns. In other words, the rise of online retail, the emergence of the digital high street, the threat of off-centre retail provision, the rise of what we're going to call convenience culture, etc., etc. And underneath those changing demographics and ethnicity. So the short-term shock of economic crisis and austerity basically pulled away the froth and exposed these underlying trends. Now, it really triggered complex effects which are only now beginning to be understood. And in particular, it's not so much that there were three big forces of change, which I'm going to call the rise of online sales, the rise of convenience culture, and the complex threat of the out of town. It's the way those three forces interacted. It's not just that they were powerful in their own right, they were especially difficult to deal with when they interacted together. And what I'll demonstrate, I hope, is that they started to work in quite disruptive and unpredictable ways. So I'll take those one by one. Where's the diagram? Oh, let's click again. Oh. Oh. Right. Okay. I see how good I am with technology. The rise of online retail and the digital high street. Everyone knows, of course, that online sales have been progressively rising from the early 2000s, reaching about 11% of total retail sales by 2014, and with spikes getting ever bigger as we went through every Christmas period. So online sales have become a really important element, and they're forecast, of course, to rise to 20%, 30%, and have a really huge impact on the economy. Now, as online retailing was getting going, it was sectorally specific. So, in other words, there were effects on some types of retail, on music and video, electricals, on book retailing, which we all know about. And we call those the substitution effects. So there are strong substitution effects going on, but not across the board, just in certain sectors. But there are also very important what we call modification effects, where the frequency and duration of shopping trips are impacted by pre-online searching. You all do it and then going to John Lewis, or you all go into John Lewis and use them as a showroom and then come out and buy on the internet. So the modification effects are as important as the substitution effects. So that was the first force of change that we've got to take account of. The second force of change was the challenge of off-centre retail development and the complex effects of the town centre first policy. Neil and I were just talking that you might invite Mary Portas to come. Mary originally took the view very strongly that it was all to do with out-of-centre retailing, the problems of the high street, that Tesco really was the public enemy number one. She's mellowed her views somewhat as time has gone on, and I hope she'll be here to present her own views. I'll try and persuade her. But she now doesn't totally believe what she believed in to start with. But it was quite easy to say in the early period of the downturn that the out-of-town retailing was killing the high street. I'm going to show you, I hope, tonight that that's not the case. It's possibly the reverse. But we all know that in the out-of-centre debate, the key turning point was 1996, when PPG 6 came in. And PPG 6 is the regulatory arm of enforcement, if you like, of what we call town centres first policy. It was a switch to protecting the town centre, which was basically subscribed to across the parties. It's just not a Labour Party view or a Conservative Party view. It has massive cross-party support. So in 1996, then, we moved to the town centres first policy. Now, post-1996, and I've got to make the point that Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland adopted town centre first policies rather later than England and rather less stringently. But town centre first policies after 1996 became arguably stronger and stronger, and out-of-centre development became increasingly difficult. And what basically happened was that some of the retailers, led by the major food retailers, developed a response to PPG 6, which was to develop small stores and basically return to the town centre. So they developed small store formats, flexed their store development programs, and fitted their stores into more difficult in-centre and edge-of-centre sites. Indeed, you may be surprised, but when the Competition Commission in 2007 asked for evidence, Tesco were able to demonstrate that only 28% of their stores, that's the lowest 28%, that's less than 1/3, were above 1,400 square metres in size. So we have this view that they're all big box operators. This is not true. As much as you can see, 72% of Tesco's stores were quite small, even by 2007. As a result, total town centre sales in food and grocery started to increase, and they went up by 40% between 2007 and 2013. So there was a big return to the town centre by the food retailers. So this is what I mean about it's not a simple matter, it's complex because of the nature of regulation. The third force of change is one that most people never really considered very much until recently, what we call the rise of convenience culture. Now, online sales are just one example or one reflection of a wider consumer reassessment of the value of time. People don't value the time in the way they did in the 70s and 80s. They're no longer totally convinced by the price and time package that an out-of-centre superstore or retail park provides. So there's been very complex and ongoing shifts in consumer behaviour for almost a decade. Some groups effectively sought convenience at the local neighbourhood level. I'd be one member of that group. And they prefer choice-edited, what we call choice-edited, simple-to-shop, smaller stores. Rather than doing the work for the retailers, they want the retailers to do the work for them. Now that reflects the growth in smaller households, non-conventional households, women in the labour force, longer working hours, an ageing population, busy lifestyles, etc. It's built on demographic trends. But it's a very important force. So if you look at IGD, they're now saying that shoppers expect grocery retailing to organise itself around their lives rather than building their routine around the retailers. So there's been a shift in the balance of power, if you like, from the retailers to the consumer. They expect to buy what they want, anytime, any place, in the most convenient way to them. So this led to a proactive response by leading retailers, as we've seen, to develop networks of small stores, and in the process, the retailers got the skills to operate those stores. Okay, so those are the three forces of change that we're going to look at as we go on. But next, I've got to sketch out to you the response of government and stakeholders to the economic crisis and its impact on the high street. Now, by the time we got into 2012, there was really significantly increasing concern in government about the rising levels of vacancy. I mean, people like the local data company were forecasting 18% vacancy rates, 20% vacancy rates, and so on. And the government were quite concerned, and rightly so, about the potential loss of social cohesion in local communities that were served by failing high streets. High streets have a very important community function, which you've got to remember. And so in May 2011, the Prime Minister set up an independent review of the problems under TV guru Mary Portas. And it was I remember being at the first meeting, it was quite interesting. And by December 2011, Mary had come up with 28 recommendations. And in March 2012, the government accepted the majority of those recommendations. And you all know the story. It was quite a slow process from that point onwards. Now, the Portas review prompted a wide range of stakeholder responses. Over the next 12 months, there were maybe a dozen reports written, including the Grimesby review, which reviewed people's sense of loss in part of the Portas report. In other words, everyone thought that Mary had missed something out, and they were quick into print to show you what they'd missed. And so that produced these enormous numbers of reports during this period. And at the end of that period, this is just a set of what the recommendations were of the various reports. So if you compare Portas with Grimesby, you can just see what Bill picked up and what Mary picked up. But in 2013, quite late on, the government decided to create a policy advisory unit called the Future High Street Forum, and to bring together leaders in retail, property, hospitality, leisure and services, and task them with understanding the challenges faced by town centres and high streets, and basically help them adjust and compete. This was quite a powerful group, and the motivations of people to be on the advisory group were varied. Some people were just looking to put their position firmly in the government agenda. Some people felt that the forum could do great things, and some of the things it did were very good indeed. For example, it did something about business rates. It basically ran a competition for the Great British High Street. It helped the town teams, it helped the Portas pilots, and it did more than you might think within 12 months. Not disassociated, I think, with the fact that there were 3 ministers during this period, one of which was on a rising trend, one of which was sacked by the government, and we're now on our 3rd minister. Now, the Future High Streets Forum was divided into 4 task and finish groups. And Group 3 was chaired by the Director General of the British Retail Consortium. And that group was charged with mobilising the evidence base to underpin the work of the other groups. So that's easy to say, but the best way to deal with it was to offload it. And they basically offloaded it to the Southampton team and myself. And we're still struggling with it. So there was a co-commissioning of an evidence review by the ESRC and by the Policy Advisory Unit. And it was funded as part of ESRC's Impact and Engagement Agenda, which you seem to be very successfully doing in Cardiff. And the idea was to co-produce knowledge with the retail sector, which had always been quite difficult in the past. So I got involved in that in this. Now, the full evidence review has taken longer than we thought because we were only sort of 2 men and a dog. And And some of our teams that were producing the evidence were 80 strong. So we were overwhelmed, really, by so many chiefs and not many Indians. But we do manage to produce two things recently. We produced a 24-page brief summary of the evidence review, which there are some hard copies of, or there were at the beginning of the lecture. Those are collector's items and should be signed by one of us. It's basically available online. So if you've got a hard copy, donate it to your grandchildren. There's interestingly two front covers of the High Street Review. One which was deemed unsatisfactory because it was the High Street in rain. I rather liked it. It was suitably depressed. And this was then replaced by the High Street in sunshine. So there are two versions. So it's like a stamp. If you get the one version with the rain, you're doing extremely well. Now, in addition to that, we've produced an edited volume of short opinion pieces by academic experts. And that's due to come out this month. And you can download that free of charge from many websites. It will be out, hopefully, by the end of October. Now, I think we should go on to some of what the evidence review revealed. The first thing I think it revealed was that we've been through a period of profound and disruptive change. However, that change is not solely technology-driven. The idea that many people have is that it's technology-driven entirely. And I'm going to say it's not. The second topic I'm going to pick up is that it's not so much a case of out-of-town causing the death of the high street, but it's possibly the reverse. And thirdly, I think I should say that far from being dead, the high street appears to be showing enormous resilience and a capacity for reinvention. So I want to pick up those three themes if I can, and hopefully you've got questions on those three things. Right. A period of profound and disruptive change. Now, as the high street crisis developed, it became increasingly clear that those forces of change, which I outlined, were working together in very complex ways, and that we were seeing what amounted to a quantum shift in shopping habits. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. The demographics of online shopping had continued to modify, pulling in to the online shoppers, people like Kevin and myself, who were in the Silver Surfers group. Possibly not. There was also the rise of m-commerce, on-the-move technologies, which people were using more and more to inform their buying decisions during the shopping process. So there were changes in the consumer side, and the retail industry itself was, of course, being subject to profound structural changes. Basically, the incumbent market leaders, the Tesco's and the Sainsbury's and the John Lewis's, who had significant legacy costs. Remember that they had a lot of sunk costs in their store networks, were being challenged with increasing effectiveness by firms whose market presence was being established on a much lower cost base as a result of internet and mobile technologies. So the industry itself was changing, the consumers were changing as a result of online retailing, and clearly technology was at the heart of the profound shifts that we were seeing. However, it wasn't everything. You should never forget the shift towards convenience culture. And that is ultimately what's driving things. And in fact, before Philip Clark got sacked, the chairman of Tesco said in a long interview in the Sunday Times, what it means to shop is going to change in a manner that is going to be so far-reaching and more rapid than we imagined. You know, there was a sense of a cataclysmic change in behavior in the consumer. And that continues to be a theme that the major retailers develop. So if you look this month, you see the CEO of Sainsbury's saying, in the last few months, the pace of change in our industry has changed beyond all recognition. Consumers are shopping very differently to the way they were shopping even a year ago. So there's this feeling that we're all in this period of turmoil. And we've done various things during this period. A lot of us have moved to local top-up shopping. And we're basically shopping more often than we did as a response to the recession, because we want to match household demand to supply, and as a result of the cost of out-of-town shopping. So there's been this big increase in the numbers of shops that you're all doing, and the top-up dimension to that. So what about this issue about the out-of-town causing the death of the high street? Now, out-of-town developments have not gone away. Don't let me give you the wrong impression. They're still very important. However, in some sectors, particularly in the grocery sector, the end of the era of once dominant out-of-town superstores and hypermarkets has been possibly reached and has certainly been flagged. So if you look at Philip Clark, he's saying, I'm not calling the end of the hypermarket. All I'm saying is that in the future, do we need to continue to build large hypermarkets in the UK when the internet is taking so much of the growth in clothing and electronics? You can reach your own conclusions. So Tesco are actually mothballing big stores or making them into dark stores to use for supplying the online sales. So in some sectors, we may have seen the turning point in the out-of-town. Oh, sorry, let me go back to it. And very importantly, if you look at the IGD forecast of the summer, the 5-year forecast, you'll find that the market share of superstores and hypermarkets is predicted to collapse over the next 5 years from 42% to 34%. So this is a significant move downwards. Now, not everyone agrees with that, but there's a very strong lobby and a very strong group of people who do believe in that figure, including the retailers, I would suggest. It'd be interesting to see what Bill says about it. So, wherever you look these days, you see the same sort of comment. The grocer's preference for smaller store formats is showing through now with the amount of proposed floor space, i.e. without planning consent, at its lowest level since the race to space began. We've really moved into a different era in which out-of-town superstores, lower-end retail parks, everyone knows what I mean by lower-end retail park, do they? The odd pets, Toys R Us with a mixture of not much distinction, could become the white elephants of the future unless they're modified into experiential destinations. So if you look at Next are trying to convert their better edge of out-of-town retail stores into experiential destinations. Has anyone seen a new Next with the columns, and they're spending a vast amount of money trying to make them into experiential destinations. And this seemed to be the only way in some out-of-town locations to save them. In contrast to the uncertain future of out-of-town development, the IGD are predicting that where the growth is going to go is into convenience retail, which is going to increase to 24% of total grocery sales by 1919. Okay? So the biggest leap forward is in convenience retail. I think there's a lot in that. The growth of the convenience sector is not solely restricted to the expansion of corporate stores. It's not just that big retailers moved into this area and developed their Tesco Expresses and Sainsbury's Locals and so on and so forth. It's basically because the symbols and independent groups grew more rapidly. So if you look at the evidence, you find that in recent periods, it's the independent convenience stores who've been growing more rapidly than the corporate convenience stores. And that growth has been sustained over a decade, not just in the period of economic prosperity, which ran to about 2006, but in the period of economic crisis and austerity that followed. So during austerity and crisis, basically the convenience sectors continued to grow. And it wasn't just corporate growth, it was independence and so on and so forth. So the next conclusion, I think, of the evidence review is that far from being dead, the high street appears to be showing great capacity for resilience and reinvention. There's increasing evidence emerging that town centres and high streets are performing surprisingly well on all sorts of metrics. And basically, what I think you can say is that the same adaptive flexibility which has kept them alive over a century or more is still a creative presence. High streets are quite creatively moving forward. Basically, they've come to assume a new role in the retail hierarchy. And if you look at any of the property companies, they're basically saying the same thing. With high street retail having seemingly weathered the worst of the economic downturn, rafts of retailer administrations and rapid technological and consumer change, we're seeing evidence of its new role in the retail hierarchy. So the high street possibly has a new role to play. And that new role will see it basically seeing new forms of symbiotic and complementary relationships emerging. New forms of complementary relationships between the traditional physical store and online retail, that the high street will work, in a sense, together with online retail, not in opposition to it. Between new complementaries and symbiotic relationships between independent specialist stores and corporate retailers, and between retailing and leisure and social community interaction in the centres. There's been a long structural move towards high streets becoming more community hubs and less retail hubs, and that's going to continue. So you've got to understand those. So the conclusion that seems to be emerging is that with many modern retail high streets being perfectly positioned for top-up shopping and achieving the right mix of multiple and independent retailers, and the mix with leisure, such as cafes and bars, the high street can position itself alongside retail online shopping, not against it. So we're seeing, if you like, click and collect, drawing people into the high street. We're seeing online retailers developing physical stores. We're seeing new forms of, if you like, complementary relationships between online retail and the physical environment. So town centres and high streets have got to be viewed, in my view, in my opinion, as a highly complex set of urban ecosystems with myriad capacities to adjust to change. And it's that myriad capacities of adjustment which is so difficult for us to pick up. We tend to think of the high streets as being one and the same, but they're not. So the next question is, if that's the case, what can we do as academics to conceptualize the process of adjustment and high street reinvention following economic shocks? What can we say as social scientists? I think we can say quite a lot. Now, what I've got to say now is that this, one of the most intriguing questions in economic geography has always been why some regional economies manage to renew themselves whilst others get locked in decline and stay locked in decline. And in the context of high street evolution, that's a very important question. What determines high streets' vulnerability and resistance to shocks? What are the mechanisms that shape the recovery of high streets and their development over time? Why do some succeed and some fail? Now, the way we've approached this, and you can see this first in a paper in Environment and Planning in 2011, is that we used a typology that Ron Martin was developing at the time, which basically drew a distinction between engineering resilience, what we call a physical science interpretation of resilience, which is basically the resistance of a system to disturbances and the speed of its bounce back to a previous pre-shock state. And comparing that to what we call ecological resilience, where there is said to be a tipping point, where if you pass over the tipping point, you move into a different stage of equilibrium stage, if you like. So you get the notion of passing through a tipping point in ecological resistance. And adaptive resilience comes out of complex systems theory. And this basically is the view that some organizations can anticipate or have a reactive reorganization of their form and their function to minimize the impact of the external or internal shock. In other words, what we call bounce forward. So what we did when we were looking at this issue, I should say not so much in the retail, in the Future High Streets Forum. I remember standing up and talking about creative destruction. And all the civil servants rushed over to me and said, no, you can't say that. So anyway, we're very keen on the notion of adaptive resilience. And when we think about adaptive resilience, you've got to basically think about some key notions. Path dependency, adaptability and adaptive capacity, variety and diversification. Does diversification act as a shock absorber to the economic impacts of these sorts of crisis shocks that we've seen? Connectedness, the way in which various agents operate and between themselves. So we're basically into a whole series of fundamental notions in economic geography. Adaptive capacity, path dependency, variety and diversification, and so on and so forth. But additionally, in the concept of adaptive resilience, you've got to have the notion of modularity. In other words, if you can maintain key functions and performances, you don't have to worry too much about the existing structures and systems. The notion is more on maintaining the function and performance rather than the physical form. So the ability of organizations to maintain their key functions in the face of disturbance by anticipating key demands from emerging trends and constantly adapting to that change is very important. Now, we also need to account for what we call, and Kevin hasn't seen this, I'm sure, what we call the adaptive cycle of high streets. There is the notion that when an economic shock hits the system, it depends where you are in the adaptive cycle. You could be in a period of innovation as a center, you could be a period of reorientation, and it depends where in this adaptive cycle you are as to how strong the economic shock is going to impact on you. And so we're basically trying to explore this notion, growth, periods of resilience declining, periods of resilience increasing, periods where resilience is low, or periods where resilience is high. And I think there's a lot in this. So which towns and high streets thrive depends to a large extent on their positioning in the adaptive cycle when the economic shock hits. Additionally, resilience is always time and place specific and scale dependent. And we're exploring some notions of domains and scales. In other words, we can imagine an adaptive cycle at each of these scales, the local, the regional, the national, the social, the economic, and the physical. And so you can imagine a whole series of adaptive cycles. That's why predicting which center is going to decline and which center is going to thrive is so difficult. But there are still very many key issues that need to be addressed. Resilience, as any geographer or planner will tell you, is a very fuzzy concept. It's in need of conceptual, explanatory, and empirical clarification. The empirical issues are obvious. How do we measure the consequences of adaptive resilience for high streets? What are our instruments sensitive enough to measure them? Is the public consensus that diversity protects high streets correct? I'm actually going to a presentation, or making a presentation on Thursday at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, where it's going to be argued by a report which Business commissioned that diversity doesn't protect high streets. So this is a very important question which is unresolved. And conceptually, how can individual actors, stakeholders, be said to operate in an anticipated model? How can a high street work, if you like, as a single organization? How can it sense that it needs to anticipate and to change? What drives it? What is the difference between high streets with what we call local heroes in them, where a local hero becomes a key driver, if you like, which other retailers emulate? How does that differ from a high street which doesn't have a local hero? Town centre doesn't have a local hero. So there's so many issues that we don't know about empirically and conceptually. And so basically, I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to Neil as our presenter for keeping to schedule as well.